She is the woman they told you never to speak of, 3 times in the mirror. The ghost with blood on her hands and a scream on her lips. The name itself, Bloody Mary, rings like a dare, like a curse. But behind the chilling folklore and the barroom drink, there was once a real woman. A woman who held a crown she was never supposed to wear. A woman whose pain was carved deeper than the dagger of any traitor. And the most terrifying part, the story they never told you, is that the blood may never have been hers to begin with. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a horror story. This is history, and it is far messier than any mirror legend. Mary Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon, was the first woman in English history to rule as queen in her own right. Not as a consort, not as a placeholder, a sovereign, a monarch, and yet, the only legacy she was allowed to keep was a name soaked in fire. Bloody, as if that was all she ever was. As if her reign could be reduced to smoke, screams, and scorched earth. But what if the real nightmare began long before the fires ever burned? Mary entered the world in the year 1516, a time when daughters were afterthoughts and sons were salvation, though her mother adored her, and her father, for a time, seemed proud of her wit and grace. The truth settled fast and cold. She was not the son, England demanded. That simple biological fact marked her. Market her for reaction. Marked her for erasure. And soon, it would mark her for vengeance. As a child, she watched her mother's heart shatter as Henry grew more restless, more distant, more desperate. The failure to produce a male heir was not just a personal sorrow, it became a national crisis. One that Henry would solve by breaking the world in two. He split from Rome, severed his marriage, and elevated Anne Boleyn to the throne. And in that violent rearranging of power, Mary was swept aside like a piece on the board, declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and forced to serve in the household of the very woman she considered a usurper. They took away her name, they took away her mother, they took away everything but her rage and her faith. Catholicism, to Mary, was not just belief, it was identity. It was memory. It was the last gift her mother gave her before dying alone, denied even the comfort of a daughter's final embrace. And that religion, that devotion, would become the seed of both her strength and her undoing. But the trauma did not end there. Anne Boleyn, too, fell, her head severed from her ambitions. Another wife, Jane Seymour, entered the picture, and at long last gave Henry the son he craved. Edward, a boy, a prince, a nail in Mary's coffin. Still, even in exile, Mary endured. She learned how to smile through threats, how to pray through tears, how to hide sharpness beneath a veil. She was patient, she was deliberate, and she was waiting. Years passed. Kings died. Half-siblings rose and fell like the tides. Edward, young and devoutly Protestant, took the crown after Henry's death and began remaking the country in his image. He saw Mary not as a sister but as a threat, her Catholicism, her closeness to the old world, a danger to the New England he envisioned. So he began to draft her out of history once more, creating a document known as the Devise for the Succession, which sought to place Lady Jane Grey, a teenage cousin, on the throne instead. When Edward died in the summer of 1553, Jane was proclaimed queen, a girl who never wanted the crown, who was pushed forward by power-hungry men, hoping to rule through her. But England remembered Mary. They remembered whose daughter she was, and more importantly, they remembered the crown was hers by law and blood. The people revolted. In just 9 days, Jane was deposed, and Mary marched into London, not as a discarded princess, but as queen. But the throne was not a rescue. It was a crucible. The years of abandonment, betrayal, humiliation. They didn't vanish. They hardened. They calcified into paranoia, into fire, into punishment dressed as piety. And though Mary tried at first to rule with mercy, the ghosts were already gathering. Jane Grey, still young and frightened, was imprisoned, though Mary longed to spare her. A rebellion tied to Jane's family sealed her fate. The axe fell again, and this time, the blood could not be washed off so easily. Mary believed she had been sent by God to restore England's soul, to bring it back to the one true faith, to finish what her mother began, and in that belief, she lit a match that would set the country ablaze. The burnings began in 1555. Heretics. They were called Protestants, preachers, mothers, even pregnant women, burned at the stake for refusing to return to Catholicism. Hundreds of lives turned to ash, while the Queen watched and prayed. And yet, history is rarely so simple, because Mary, for all her fire, bled too. Her heart broke again and again when her phantom pregnancy faded, when her husband Philip abandoned her, when her people turned against her. She thought she was carrying the future of Catholic England in her womb, only to realize too late that what grew inside her was not a prince, but a tumor, a death sentence. She died childless, powerless, alone. And then came the story. They gave her a name, Bloody Mary. They turned her into a ghost, a monster, a mirror trick, while Elizabeth, her sister and successor, who would go on to kill more, was wrapped in gold and myth and glory. History is not fair. It is written by those who survive and those who win. But Mary Tudor's legacy is not just one of fire. It is a warning, a question. What happens to a girl they never wanted? What happens to a woman whose pain is never allowed to heal? If you say her name 3 times in the dark, perhaps it is not vengeance you summon. Perhaps it is grief. She came into the world with the eyes of the kingdom already looking past her. Born in the year 1516, Mary Tudor arrived in a palace filled with golden hopes and heavy expectations, but she carried the wrong body for the world she had entered. Her birth was not celebrated with the cannon fire or endless toasts reserved for a future king. Instead, there was a strained politeness, a quiet sigh behind every smile. She was healthy. Yes. She was intelligent. Yes. But she was a girl. And to her father, King Henry VIII, that made all the difference. Catherine of Aragon, her mother, loved her daughter fiercely. She poured her devotion into Mary, raising her with care and pride, teaching her Latin and music, instilling in her a deep reverence for the Catholic Church. But as the years passed and no brothers followed, that pride turned to dread. Catherine knew her time was slipping. Mary may have been her treasure, but she was not the heir Henry had gambled his soul for. The king began to drift from his queen and, in time, from the entire Catholic order that had blessed their union. Mary was still a child when the first cracks shattered the foundations of her world. Her father's affection turned cold. His frustration grew louder. His gaze moved toward a younger woman, Anne Boleyn, bold and raven-haired, who whispered of sons and legacies and crowns untouched by Rome. What began as flirtation soon became destruction. Catherine was pushed aside, denied her title, her marriage declared invalid by the king himself, and Mary, the only child of that discarded union, was dragged down with her. They stripped Mary of her title, no longer a princess. She became the Lady Mary, a label soaked in political disdain. They took away her privileges, her rooms, her attendants. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. Henry forbade Mary from seeing her mother again, not even in sickness, not even on her deathbed. The girl who had once been the hope of a nation was now punished for the very blood that made her royal, alone, and confused. She was sent to live in the household of her father's new queen, Anne Boleyn, her mother's rival. The woman she blamed for her family's downfall now ruled the very court that had banished her. And worse, she was now tasked with caring for her half-sister Elizabeth, Anne's newborn daughter, a baby who bore the title Mary had lost. Every day in that house was a humiliation. Every nod to Anne as Your Majesty. Every curt dismissal. Every scolding for refusing to acknowledge Elizabeth's claim to the crown carved deeper wounds into Mary's heart. But even under the weight of exile, Mary did not break. Instead, she folded herself into silence and prayer. Her faith, once a comfort, now became her armor. She clung to the rituals of the old church, the Latin Mass, the Holy Rosary, the memory of her mother's voice, whispering psalms in the dark. Even as the Church of England rose, even as Protestants began to reshape the country's soul, Mary refused to bend. She saw herself not as a lost princess, but as a defender of truth, God's truth. Her stubbornness was not political, it was sacred. Her body, however, began to betray her. In her teenage years, she suffered from irregular menstruation and bouts of deep melancholy. The royal physicians were baffled, unsure how to treat a girl they no longer recognized as royal. The stress of rejection, of fear, of being watched and whispered about daily, had twisted into her veins. Some believed she was cursed. Others believed she was losing her mind. But Mary, though often fragile, was not weak. Beneath the surface, she was forging something harder than steel. She was learning how to endure. Her half-sister Elizabeth was growing in popularity. The court admired her wit, her poise, her clever Protestant polish. But Mary watched with eyes sharpened by pain. She did not hate Elizabeth, at least not yet, but she knew what the girl represented. A future without her, a legacy that erased her mother, of her faith, her name. When Anne Boleyn fell from favour and was executed, Mary was quietly summoned back to court. Jane Seymour, Henry's next queen, had urged the king to reconcile with his daughter, and though Mary was allowed to return, the damage had already been done. She was an adult, now no longer the delicate child they remembered. The court did not welcome her with open arms. She was tolerated, inspected, measured like a relic from another age. Jane Seymour, to her credit, showed Mary genuine warmth. They found a kinship in shared loss, and the understanding that neither woman had truly chosen their place in this brutal game of succession. When Jane died from childbirth complications after giving Henry the son he craved, Edward the Court was plunged into grief. But for Mary, the sorrow was laced with dread. A male heir meant she had once again been pushed aside, this time for good. Still, Jane's kindness bore fruit after her death. Her dying wish had been to see Mary reinstated in the line of succession, and though it would take the intervention of Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, it eventually happened. By the time the king lay on his deathbed, both Mary and Elizabeth had been restored at least legally to the royal line. But legal status meant little in a court that changed its loyalties with the wind. When Henry VIII died in the year 1547, 9-year-old Edward ascended the throne. Mary, now in her 30s, knew that time was against her. She was unmarried, childless, and out of favour with the Protestant majority. Still, she remained composed, sending gifts and letters, attending ceremonies with grace. For a few brief years, her relationship with Edward remained cordial. She was, after all, his sister. But politics does not honour blood. Edward began to view Mary's Catholicism as a threat to his reforms. The young king, though tender in age, was iron-willed in his beliefs. As Protestantism spread across England, Mary became a living contradiction, a princess who prayed in Latin, who refused to attend Protestant services, who still kept images of the Virgin Mary and the crucifix. Rumours swirled. Parliament grew uneasy. Edward's advisers urged him to act, and so he did. In the final years of his reign, Edward drafted his devise for the succession, a legal document meant to bypass Mary and Elizabeth entirely. He sought to name Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as heir. Jane was young, intelligent, and more importantly, compliant. Edward believed she could preserve his religious legacy where his sisters would destroy it. It was a gamble, and like many gambles born of fear, it was doomed to fail. When Edward died in the summer of 1553, Jane was proclaimed queen. Mary, upon hearing the news, did not weep. She did not panic. She did not beg. She gathered her supporters. She rode north, and the people came, old lords, Catholic nobles, commoners who still remembered her mother's name. All of them rallied to Mary's banner. Within 9 days, the coup collapsed. Jane Grey was captured, and Mary Tudor, the princess they tried to erase, walked into London, not as a guest, not as a relic, but as a queen. But the path to power had cost her dearly. She arrived at the gates of her kingdom with a crown on her head and ashes in her mouth. This was not a beginning. This was a reckoning. And the world would soon learn what happens when a woman who was never meant to rule finally does. When Mary Tudor first held the reins of power in her hands, they were already bruised with memory. Her crown was not inherited in grace, but pulled from the ashes of betrayal. And even as she stood victorious, the shadows of her past lingered like breath upon her neck. The court cheered her name, but she knew how quickly cheers could curdle into silence. She had been erased once before. She would not allow it to happen again. And yet, across the palace corridors, through embroidered tapestries and painted walls, another figure moved like a whisper, sharper, younger, golden, in the eyes of a people weary of suffering. Elizabeth, her sister, her rival, her mirror, they were bound by blood, but divided by fire. Elizabeth had been born from the chaos that had destroyed Mary's world. The child of Anne Boleyn, the woman Mary had refused to call queen, the very name that had ripped their family apart, and yet Mary had once held that child in her arms, once stroked her copper hair, once, in the stillness of the nursery, she had wondered if perhaps they could grow beyond the wreckage of their mothers. But that tenderness had long turned sour, because Elizabeth, unlike Mary, had been raised with an instinct for survival, where Mary clung to truth and endured the cost. Elizabeth learned to bend, to charm, to say the right thing at the right time, and hold her real thoughts behind a smile. And the kingdom noticed. The nobles whispered. The people compared, always compared. The older sister, sullen and severe, chained to a bleeding faith. The younger one, clever and bright, glowing with the promise of something new. Even as Mary ascended the throne, she could hear the rumblings that Elizabeth would be a better queen, that Elizabeth understood the people, that Elizabeth would not burn the nation to preserve a crumbling church. Mary tried to silence the noise with mercy. She pardoned those who had rebelled in Jane Grey's name. She allowed Elizabeth to walk freely through court. She invited her to banquets, seated her at the edge of power. But kindness cannot erase suspicion, not when it is built upon years of betrayal, and not when her enemies began to gather behind the younger woman, promising her a future, and whispering that Mary's crown would not last long. But Elizabeth, for all her silence, was not blameless. She played the game well too well. She claimed Protestantism only in private, but in public, she danced between lines. She smiled at the right people. She kept company with the ambitious, and when Sir Thomas Wyatt raised his ill-fated rebellion against the Spanish marriage, Elizabeth's name was found in the margins of every plan. It didn't matter that she denied involvement. It didn't matter that no proof ever surfaced. Mary's counsel pressed her to act, to imprison the girl, to do what had been done to her so many years before. And for a moment, Mary hesitated. She did not want to become her father. She did not want to crush her sister. But fear, once awakened, does not rest easily. Elizabeth was arrested and brought to the Tower, the same stone prison that had once held Jane Grey, the same walls that now whispered treason in Mary's ear. And as the rain fell on the Thames, and the bells echoed over London's spires, the people watched with bated breath, wondering if the axe would fall once more. It didn't. Mary, against the advice of her council and the fervour of the court, released Elizabeth after 2 months of cold silence. Perhaps she still believed in redemption. Perhaps she saw too much of herself in the young woman with the lion's eyes. Or perhaps she feared what killing Elizabeth would unleash upon a kingdom already strained to the breaking point. But nothing would ever be the same between them again. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain did not bring the joy she had longed for. He was 10 years her junior, cold and distant, more crown than husband. The people hated the match, fearing foreign rule and papal chains. Mary had thought love would save her. Instead, it hollowed her out. Then came the pregnancy that wasn't. She believed with all her heart that God had finally answered her prayers. Her belly swelled. Her cravings changed. Her body gave every sign. The court rejoiced. The kingdom prepared. And then, nothing. The child never came. And with it, something inside her broke for good. She turned to fire. The Protestant heretics, she declared, would either return to the truth or face judgment. And judgment came in smoke and screams. The executions began in earnest. Bishops, preachers, midwives, farmhands, children. The fires lit London's sky with a fever that did not cool. And as Mary burned heretics in the name of salvation, Elizabeth remained silent. She made no public statements, no protests. She smiled. She nodded. She waited. Mary saw it all. She saw the way the people turned their gaze toward her sister, the way the court grew quiet when Elizabeth entered, the way her husband, distant and bored, lingered a little too long in her presence. And though she never spoke it aloud, the old fear returned, that Elizabeth would take everything that she already had. And so Mary did the only thing she had ever been taught to do. She endured. She prayed harder. She signed more death warrants. She clutched her rosary until her knuckles turned white. But inside, the storm grew louder. Her body ached. Her heart dimmed. And the image of her sister young, untouchable, endlessly adored, haunted her steps. By the time Mary realized she was dying, there was no one left she could trust. Philip had long since abandoned her. The nobles watched her with quiet calculation. The people had turned cold. And Elizabeth. Elizabeth was already being measured for the throne. Still, Mary refused to name her as heir, even in her final weeks. She tried to rally support for her cousin in Spain. She begged her advisors to find another way. But the winds had shifted. The old queen had burned too much, and the young woman waiting in the wings had learned well. On the morning of her final breath, Mary looked out across a kingdom she had loved so fiercely it had turned against her. She had fought to restore her mother's faith, to heal her people's souls, to give England a son, a legacy, a salvation. Instead, she gave them Elizabeth, and as she closed her eyes for the last time, perhaps the thought that lingered, like incense in the dark, was not of fire or failure, but of a sister who had waited in silence and stolen everything without drawing a blade. The crown was not a symbol of triumph, not for her, When it was placed upon Mary Tudor's head, it did not shine with joy or destiny. It trembled. As the velvet weight settled against her temple, it carried not the light of heaven, but the shadows of the dead. It carried her mother's prayers, whispered from a cold convent. It carried Jane Grey's last breath, silenced in the tower. It carried the broken voice of a sister who refused to speak the truth, and the hollow echo of a nation that could not decide if it loved her or feared her more. From the moment she became queen, Mary walked through a palace haunted not by spirits, but by memory. The walls of Whitehall still held the laughter of Anne Boleyn before her fall. The royal tapestries still bore the stitched initials of Elizabeth's mother, faded but never fully torn away. And the eyes of the court, though bowed in formality, never forgot what Mary had once been, the girl denied, the child erased, the daughter who had been told again and again that her blood was not enough. Now she ruled them, and she ruled alone. Philip of Spain, her husband in title, was not the balm she had prayed for. He was foreign, aloof, ceremonial. He fulfilled his duties with mechanical grace, spoke to her with measured politeness, and withdrew behind closed doors when the day's pageantry ended. Mary, who had spent her entire life aching for love, did not know what to do with this man who treated her like a political contract. She tried to be soft. She tried to be devout. She prayed at his side. She whispered in Spanish. She offered him her whole heart like a gift wrapped in scar tissue. But Philip never reached for it. And so, Mary turned her attention elsewhere, to the thing that had always comforted her, in loneliness, her faith. The dream had always been simple. She would restore the true religion. She would undo her father's rupture with Rome. She would bring England back into the embrace of the Church. And through that act, redeem all the sins committed in her name. In her blood? But dreams, once tested by fire, do not remain soft for long. What began as devotion soon calcified into obsession. Her confessor whispered of cleansing. Her counsel, Unche hesitant, soon learned that resistance to the Queen's will was dangerous. And the people, already wary, grew colder with each proclamation. Still, Mary believed, not just in the Church, but in her role as saviour. She saw herself not as a monarch who ruled by chance, but as a vessel chosen by divine providence. She was not simply restoring Catholicism, she was correcting time itself. She was burning away the infection that had poisoned her father's soul, silenced her mother's prayers, and threatened her own name. She was making England holy again, and in that mission, there could be no compromise. So came the fires. They began quietly at first, as all horrors do. One preacher, then two, a handful of peasants who refused to recant, then a bishop, then a child. The pyres were lit not only in London, but in towns whose names never made the chronicles. The sky, once filled with incense and song, now carried the scent of flesh. And yet, Mary did not flinch. She believed the pain was necessary. She believed that the cries rising from the flames were a chorus of correction, that, through agony, souls would be purified, and the nation reborn. But the ghosts would not stay quiet. The people began to murmur. At first, only in whispers behind doors, then in the markets, then, on the steps of cathedrals. The name they had once spoken with reverence turned bitter on their tongues. Mary. Bloody Mary. The insult took root like rot beneath the floorboards. It followed her through the corridors. It echoed behind her carriage wheels. It was scrawled in candle soot on chapel stones. She tried not to hear it. She tried to pray it away. She told herself it was the cost of holiness. And then came the child. Or what she believed was a child. In the second year of her reign, Mary's body began to change. Her Stomachswell, her cycle stopped. Her appetite shifted. The court rejoiced. Prayers rang from every chapel. Trumpets were tuned in anticipation of a prince. The people who had grown cold toward their queen softened, if only for a moment, as the promise of continuity, of a male Catholic heir, loomed on the horizon. Mary believed with all her heart that God had given her this gift. After all the humiliation, the exile, the loneliness, she had finally been chosen not only as queen, but as mother. She withdrew into confinement, as was custom, preparing for labor. The days passed. The signs multiplied. Midwives waited. Cribs were readied. But no child came. The court grew anxious. The silence stretched. Rumors spread gossip born in the kitchens and carried on servant tongues. Some whispered that she had faked the pregnancy. Others that the baby had died in the womb. Still others said the swelling was not life at all, but sickness, a tumor, a punishment, a sign from heaven. Mary refused to believe any of it. She clutched her belly. She prayed louder. She waited in the dark as hope decayed inside her. And when, at last, the swelling faded and no cries were heard, she emerged, not as a mother, but as a woman broken open by silence. The ghosts grew louder then. Jane Grey, whose death had haunted the edges of every conversation. Her mother Catherine, whose memory was now twisted into prophecy. The hundreds whose lives had ended in smoke. And the child who had never drawn breath. They pressed in on Mary from every side. But she did not retreat. She did not bend. Instead, she did what she had always done. What she had been taught to do since the moment her father declared her illegitimate. She endured. She returned to her council. She doubled her orders. More heretics. More flames. The air grew heavier with each passing month. Her eyes darkened. Her hands shook. Her husband left. And still, the crown remained on her head. But it no longer gleamed. It groaned. Because the truth was simple. And Mary knew it. Even if she could not speak it aloud, the throne she had fought so hard to claim was not a place of power. It was a tomb, a cold, golden sarcophagus, in which she was slowly being buried alive, day after day, by a people who no longer loved her, by a God she feared had abandoned her, and by a history that was already beginning to turn its face away. She wore her crown like a penance, and England watched. It began with hope, not loud, not triumphant, but soft and trembling, like a candle lit in a room that had gone cold. Mary Tudor, Queen of England, child of rejection and fire, woke one morning and felt something stir within her, something small, something secret, something sacred. Her belly was swelling. Her appetite was shifting. The court physicians, stiff with protocol and fear, whispered carefully of conception. Her ladies in waiting exchanged glances and bowed a little deeper. Mary smiled, for the first time in many months, with something that looked like light. She told herself it was a miracle. She told herself it was God's gift at last. The long-delayed reward for a life bent in supplication. For a heart that had suffered quietly beneath the gold trim of the monarchy. She told herself that the child growing within her was more than a royal heir. It was proof that the pain had not been meaningless. That the humiliations of girlhood, the silences of exile, the ashes of Jane Grey, the cold shoulder of Philip, the betrayal of her own body, none of it had been in vain. England believed her. At first, the bells rang across the realm. Courtiers rushed to prepare gifts. Prayers were ordered in every cathedral. Midwives were summoned from the countryside, and tapestries were commissioned, showing the Virgin Mother cradling a crowned son beneath the Star of Bethlehem. This child, they whispered, would save her reign. This child would unite the realm, restore glory, erase the fires, and end the doubts that had clung to Mary like smoke. This child would be her redemption. But time, that ancient thief, does not bend to longing, As the weeks passed, the whispers began. They started small in the kitchens, among servants who remembered other royal confinements, who counted the days and found them wanting. Some said the Queen's body changed too slowly. Others said she changed too much. Some noted that she had bled slightly, then not at all. Others claimed to have seen her doubled over in pain behind closed doors. And all of them, in time, came to the same question. Spoken first in secret, then in public, then in Parliament itself. What if there was no child? Mary would not hear it. She silenced any doctor who dared to suggest alternative causes. She refused to be examined in the manner of lesser women. Her body was a sacred space. Her womb, the altar of the nation. She locked the door and knelt on stone floors until her knees bled. She pressed her trembling hands over the rise of her belly and whispered to it as if it could hear, as if her voice alone could coax it into becoming real. Philip, ever distant, wrote polite letters from abroad. He congratulated her, instructed her to name the child after his father, and promised to return in time for the birth. But his words were thin, brittle things, and Mary could feel it the way he did not believe her, the way no one truly did. And still she waited. She secluded herself from the court. She ate only holy foods. She banned any talk of Elizabeth or succession. She would not name a regent. She would not draft a contingency. The kingdom would have its prince. She would hold him in her arms. She would baptize him with the water of Rome and place the crown gently into the hands of a child born of her own body and God's mercy. But no cries pierced the silence. No water broke. No pain came. Instead, her belly, once taut with promise, began to soften. The silence around her grew deafening. Her ladies stopped singing in the halls. The cradles were removed from the nursery. The pages who had once shouted joy in the corridors now looked to the ground when she passed. And Mary, once more, found herself walking a palace that did not believe in her. By late spring, she could no longer deny what her heart had begun to scream in winter. There was no child. There never had been. It was not a miscarriage, for she had not delivered. It was not stillbirth, for no life had begun. And yet her belly had risen. Her symptoms had been real. The nation had witnessed them. Some now spoke of phantom pregnancy, others of hysteria. The cruelest whispered of divine punishment or secret sin. Still others claimed witchcraft or possession, spinning tales of Mary's jealousy, of Elizabeth's rising star, of the dead. Jane Grey crying curses from the grave. Mary herself said nothing. She simply stopped speaking of the child. But inside, something collapsed. The grief was not loud. It did not come with tears or screams. It came with a hollowing. She walked slower. She slept less. She ceased to look out the window. The rosary she once clutched with reverent devotion now hung loosely from her fingers like a chain too heavy to lift. Her confession grew longer, her prayers more desperate. She begged God to explain, to justify, to reveal his meaning. But heaven was silent. And so, she began to wonder if she had failed him. If the burnings had not been sacrifice but cruelty, if the blood on her hands had stained more than history, if it had stained her soul. But the thought was unbearable, and so she buried it beneath a new hope. A second pregnancy, or so she thought.
Indeed.
Months after the phantom had faded, her body once again betrayed her with signs bloating, tenderness, sudden bleeding. She grasped at them like a drowning woman reaching for reeds. She told her ladies. She announced it to the court. She wrote to Philip, who responded with cautious warmth. But this time, the kingdom did not rejoice. They remembered. They waited. And the days passed, and the belly did not swell, and her strength did not return, and her voice, once resolute, began to crack at the edges. The truth, when it finally came, was as cruel as it was simple. Mary was not with child. She was dying. Of what? No one could say for certain. But the whispers spoke of her womb, of cancer, of decay. Her blood had betrayed her one last time. The very place from which she had hoped to give England a future had now become the source of her undoing. She spent her final weeks not in royal glory, but in a slow retreat from the world. The fires had dimmed. Her council spoke more openly of Elizabeth. The people lit fewer candles in her name. The streets that had once hailed her arrival now watched her with silent, waiting eyes. She had once dreamed of being a mother. She had once believed she would hold a prince in her arms and wash away the past. But in the end, she held nothing. Not a child, not her husband, not even the love of her people. And as she faded, the only thing that remained constant, cold, unyielding, was the crown on her head, and the ghosts that had gathered there long before her first breath as queen. The wind that swept through London in the winter of 1555 carried more than the stench of ash. It carried a promise, one whispered through the chapel vaults, echoed in the marble corridors, and sung by a queen whose heart had turned to ember. Mary Tudor no longer sought adoration. She no longer waited for love. She no longer bent her prayers toward the sky with hope of a child. A husband, a people's affection. She had been stripped of all tenderness, hollowed by loss, scorched by silence, and what remained was the fire, and she believed the fire would save them all. The heretics, she told herself, were sick, infected with the poison of false doctrine, deceived by the errors of Luther, emboldened by the arrogance of Henry's broken church. They had turned their backs on the Holy Mother, defiled the sacraments, spat upon the saints, and worst of all, they had dared to call it truth. Mary, ever her mother's daughter, ever Rome's most devout child, could not let that stand. Not any more. She did not begin with hatred. Not in her mind. She began with righteousness. It was not vengeance she sought. She told her confessor, it was restoration. It was not punishment. She desired it was penance. It was not death. She demanded it was rebirth. Through flame, through agony, through the purifying fire of God's justice. And so she signed the orders, one parchment at a time, one name at a time, one soul at a time. The first executions were solemn, reserved for high-ranking traitors cloaked in Protestant robes, bishops who had preached defiance, scholars who had translated the Bible into the vulgar tongue, men who had dared to stand in pulpits and deny the real presence. Mary did not attend the burnings, but she read the reports. She asked if they had recanted. She was told they had not, and she wept not for the charred bodies, but for the souls she believed had chosen damnation over mercy. But the flames did not stop with the bishops. They spread to merchants, to midwives, to artisans and shepherds, to women so poor they could not name the 7 sacraments, to men who had never held a Bible, only heard one read aloud in their village square, to children who had been raised in the religion of their time and had never known Rome except as a name in the mouths of the angry. The fires consumed them all, and London began to change. Where once the air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and coal smoke, now it reeked of human skin. Where once church bells rang with joy, now they tolled like funeral drums. The people, those who had once cheered for Mary, who had hailed her as the daughter of true faith, grew quiet. They did not speak against her, not aloud, but their silence pressed thick upon the city, heavier than snow, colder than steel. And Mary, blind in her devotion, mistook their silence for guilt. She believed it was working. She believed they were ashamed. She believed, as the executions rose into the hundreds, that England was beginning to repent. But the truth was far more terrible. The people were not repenting. They were remembering how it felt to be ruled by fear, remembering the scent of burning straw and flesh, remembering the last screams of a pregnant woman who cried for her unborn child before the flames swallowed her whole. Mary did not see their revulsion. She saw only their stillness, and read it as surrender. Her counsel grew restless. Some advisers whispered caution. They urged her to stop, to slow the executions, to consider the politics, the public, the consequences. But Mary would not hear them. She had lost everything but this mission, this calling, this divine labor to return England to grace. She would not stop at the threshold of redemption. Not when she had come so far. Not when she had bled so much. Not when she still knelt every night beside a cold bed and asked God to show her the way, and felt the fire rise again in her chest like an answer. She believed it was God's voice, but it was grief. And grief, once ignited, burns with a holy cruelty. Elizabeth, her sister, stayed quiet. She did not protest the executions. She did not challenge Mary's theology. She watched. She waited. She held her tongue. And Mary, deep down, feared her for it, not for the silence, but for the precision of it, for the way Elizabeth navigated the court like a blade wrapped in silk, for the way she grew more beloved with each year, even as the Queen grew more feared. But Mary could not undo what had been set in motion. She had passed the point of no return, the Marian persecutions. They would later be called a name etched in history like a scar. Nearly 300 people burned at the stake, hundreds more arrested, interrogated, tortured, and left to rot. Entire villages stained with the memory of fire. And at the center of it all, a woman who had once prayed for peace and found only ashes in her hands. They began to call her Bloody Mary. She heard it. Eventually, she never acknowledged it. She told herself it was the price of salvation. But in the stillest hours of night, when even the candles flickered like frightened birds, she would lie awake and remember the smell of smoke. And perhaps, in those moments, some part of her began to wonder not if she was wrong. For Mary could never admit that, but if God had gone silent, not out of anger, but out of sorrow. And still, she did not stop. Because to stop would be to admit defeat. To stop would be to unravel. To stop would be to look upon the field of bones she had sown and see not the seeds of salvation, but the ruin of everything she had loved, everything she had lost, and everything she had become. He arrived not with roses, but with treaties, not with love, but with lineage, not with warmth, but with warning in every glance he gave. And yet, when Philip of Spain stepped into the palace, Mary Tudor looked at him, not as the man her council had arranged for her, not as the cold son of a colder empire, but as a miracle in motion, a promise come alive, the second half of a life she had waited too long to begin. She had not married for politics, though politics demanded it. She had not married for heirs, though the realm begged for them. She had married because somewhere inside her grief-shaped soul still flickered the belief that to be loved was not a sin, that it was not too late, that even queens, especially queens, deserved someone to stay when the candles were out and the crown removed. Philip did not stay. He stood beside her during the wedding, stoic, pristine, regal in the way. Marble is regal, polished, perfect, and incapable of warmth. He smiled when the archbishop placed their hands together. He kissed her forehead when the bells rang. He played the part as expected. But when the doors closed and the crowds dispersed, Mary understood something more devastating than loneliness. She understood distance intimate, careful, and calculated. Philip fulfilled his duties, as a sovereign should. He spoke to her with measured courtesy. He joined her at council meetings. He wrote letters to the Pope, urging support for England's Catholic revival. He walked with her through gardens when expected and dined with her beneath chandeliers that trembled with the weight of years. But when the hours grew late, When the corridors quieted, Philip disappeared into his own chambers, and Mary remained in hers. Still queen, still wife, still alone. She tried. God knows she tried. She wore the Spanish silks he favoured. She greeted him in his language. She prayed with him at the altar. Her voice trembling with longing, she softened her edges, bent her will, lowered her gaze, not as a woman afraid, but as a woman who still believed that if she made herself small enough, quiet enough, gentle enough, he might, one day, choose to stay a little longer at her side. He did not. He was 10 years her junior. Young, sharp, raised in a court that saw women as vessels for succession and little else. He had not come to England for a wife. He had come for a crown, a foothold, a geopolitical calculation, and though he wore the ring, and stood at the altar, and pressed his lips to her brow, Philip never reached for Mary's hand in darkness. He never touched her hair when she cried. He never saw the Queen curled beneath the velvet, praying not for peace, not for power, but simply to be wanted. When she told him she was with child, his reply was prompt and proper. He congratulated her. He promised to return for the birth. He even allowed a portrait to be commissioned of the unborn heir, cradled between them, in imagined splendour. But his eyes, even in oil and pigment, never looked at her. And when the belly softened, and the rumours spread, and the baby that never was faded into silence, Philip was already gone. He had business in Flanders, wars to manage, papers to sign, and perhaps, more importantly, distance to maintain. He would return once more. Briefly, a visit shaped by duty, not devotion, and Mary, ever hopeful, ever bruised, but still reaching, tried once again to offer him her heart wrapped in ceremony. She arranged feasts. She had songs written in his name. She placed fresh roses at his place at table, every morning. But he noticed none of it. He sat beside her, but never with her, and when he left for the second time, he did not promise to return. Mary watched his ship sail from the harbour with a face no painter dared to capture. It was not anger that consumed her. It was vacancy. The slow, cruel realization that her husband had never truly belonged to her, that her bed had never been shared, that her title as wife was written only in ink, not in breath, not in skin, not in love. Her Kirche grew quiet. They did not speak of Philip unless asked. The people mocked in hushed tones, calling her a queen without a consort, a bride abandoned at the altar of empire, and Elizabeth, her sister. Her shadow walked the court with more grace than ever, her every movement reminding Mary of youth, of charisma, of a kind of beauty that had never belonged to her. Mary aged quickly in those years. The mirror, once ignored, became a stranger. Her hair thinned, her skin pale, her voice, once thunderous in Parliament and steady before the fires, now cracked when she prayed. The rosary beads slipped more easily through her fingers. Not out of piety, but weariness. Her steps grew slower. Her gaze? More distant. And each time she passed the empty throne beside hers, the one meant for Philip, she felt not anger, but absence. And yet, she still spoke of him. In letters, in prayers, in the way her fingers lingered on the edge of his empty chair before pulling away, as if touching the ghost of a man might bring him back to flesh. He never returned. He sent no farewell, no apology, not even a final lie. And so, when illness began to fold her body in upon itself, when her womb rotted with the sorrow of a second false pregnancy, when the court grew bold enough to speak of Elizabeth as the next sovereign, Mary said nothing. She held no grudge. She issued no curse. She simply stopped waiting, and in the final months of her life, the room she occupied most was not her chapel. nor her throne room, but her bedchamber quiet, candle-lit, shrouded in velvet, with a chair beside her that remained unfilled. A chair meant for a husband, a chair that bore no weight, a chair that stared back at her with the same silence Philip had always given. And when she finally closed her eyes, it was not fire, she remembered, not the screams, not the sermons, not even the child she never held. It was the sound of footsteps, walking away measured, polite, final, and the echo they left behind. In the final season of her reign, Mary Tudor no longer resembled the woman who had ridden into London to cries of salvation and the clamour of bells. The flame in her chest, once called faith, had dimmed into smoke. The fire in her eyes, once called purpose, had faded into shadow. Her body, once stiff with royal defiance, now bent slowly beneath the weight of an invisible illness, her steps dragging along the palace stones like leaves in a dying autumn. And England, that fickle mirror of monarchs, had already begun to turn its gaze elsewhere. The court no longer spoke of her as they once had. There were no fresh tapestries commissioned, no songs composed in her name. The nobility walked the halls with eyes cast beyond the Queen's chambers, whispering of Elizabeth, her youth, her Protestant cleverness, her golden hair. Mary had become a relic, not a ruler. Her presence, something mourned in advance, not grieved in earnest. Her body had betrayed her once again, though this time there was no hope of life to come. The swelling was not pregnancy, nor miracle. It was decay. Some said it was cancer, deep in the womb that had never borne a child. Others spoke of ulcers, or melancholia, or divine judgment that had turned inward like a sword without mercy. But whatever it was, it hollowed her from within, quietly and completely. And still, she did not scream. Queens do not scream. Instead, she prayed, not with the fervour of her early reign, not with the thunder of belief, but with a quiet, wavering whisper like a child asking not to be forgotten. She asked for Philip. He did not come. She asked for Elizabeth. She did not dare, and so, in the rooms where once the fate of empires was written, there was only the sound of wind brushing the velvet drapes, and the slow breath of a woman who had ruled in fire but would die in silence. There was no procession waiting outside her door, no physicians pacing nervously, no royal family gathered with clasped hands and bowed heads. The courtiers stood at a distance, waiting not to weep, but to act, to transfer allegiance, to rewrite oaths, to survive the passing of a queen by preparing for the rise of the next. Even the servants tiptoed more than usual, not out of reverence, but out of fear that their names might be tied too tightly to hers, fear that too much grief might be remembered later as complicity. And Mary, lying beneath the heavy canopy of her royal bed, could feel it all: the absence of love, the coldness of duty, the space beside her that had never been filled. Her rosary lay slack between her fingers, beads unmoving. Her lips no longer formed words, not because she had stopped believing, but because even belief, when unanswered for too long, curls in on itself and becomes quiet. She did not die in thunder. She did not die in agony. She did not even die in sleep. She died in stillness. A long, slow folding inward, like a curtain drawn over a window no one would open again. And when the news came, the kingdom did not wail. No black veils covered shop windows. No candles flickered at every doorstep. No songs of mourning rose from cathedral choirs with trembling voices. The bells rang. Yes, but they rang with an air of obligation, not grief. The people listened, nodded, and turned back to their bread and their bargaining. They spoke her name with careful neutrality. Bloody Mary, Queen Mary, the Catholic Queen, the one who burned, the one who could not give us a child, the one who left us colder than she found us. And in that strange quiet, history began to do its cruel work. The same scribes who had once written of her glory now dipped their quills in different ink. They recorded her failures, her fires, her empty womb, her husband's retreat, her sister's rising star. The first Queen of England in her own right was given no monument worthy of that title. She was buried. Yes, with ceremony, with Latin, with incense, but beside her lay only her father Henry. The man who broke her mother, broke the church, broke her, and no child between them to bridge the distance in stone. Elizabeth ascended the throne before the marble over Mary's grave had even dried. The court dressed in brighter colours, the churches changed their hymns, and the people, those who had once shouted Mary's name in the streets as saviour, now raised their voices to the sky for a queen they had not yet crowned, as if they had always been waiting for her. And so, Mary passed into shadow. She became legend, not the kind sung in lullabies, but the kind whispered in fear, not the woman who tried to restore her faith, not the daughter who avenged her mother, not the queen who ruled alone in a kingdom that despised her very breath, but the ghost in the mirror, the name scratched into superstition, the face imagined in flame and smoke and red. She became Bloody Mary, and no one asked what had bled, or why, or whether it had been a wound long opened by others, by a father who shamed her, by a church that left her, by a people who wanted a son, then a saviour, then someone prettier, younger, and easier to forgive. Her name remained, but not her story, not the one she would have told. Had anyone stayed long enough beside her bed to ask, if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with something quieter, something behind the eyes, or beneath the bones, you might hear her still, not screaming, not pleading, but waiting, the way the air waits before a storm, the way the sea holds its breath before turning tide. She never truly left. You know, not the way others do. Her body was buried. Yes, in stone and silence, beneath the weight of titles that no longer mattered. But her story never rested. Mary, they taught you to fear her name, taught you to say it into a mirror, not a prayer, taught you to expect blood, not longing, but they did not teach you how she lived, or how she died, or how every act she made, however cruel, however desperate, was not born from evil, but from a hunger so deep it swallowed everything she touched. She was a daughter first, before she was a queen, before she was a ghost, before the flames and the name. She was a child who watched her mother weep behind closed doors, who reached for a father who pulled his hand away, who prayed not for power, but to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved without condition. But kings do not raise daughters in softness, and England does not forgive women who bleed. She was a bride, too, in her own way, not to a man, for he was never truly hers, but to a vision, to a dream, to a church built in the ruins of her mother's exile. She married herself to restoration, to the impossible labour of unbreaking what had been shattered. And when that love went unreturned, she did not stop loving. She burned for it. She sacrificed for it. She gave everything, and still, she remained alone. It would be easy, comforting, even to close the book here, to tuck her away beneath the words they carved into the stone, to let her remain the woman they warned us about, to say that she was cruel, that she was mad, that she died as she lived too hard, too faithful, too full of fire. But we owe her more than that. We owe her pause, a long, slow breath between the pages of history, because somewhere, in the folds of velvet sheets, no one touched. Beneath the weight of a crown that no longer warmed her, behind the eyes that had once been called regal, but now only reflected regret, there was still a woman. A woman who waited for a husband to come home, for a child to be born, for her people to say, just once, that they understood, but no one came. The door never opened, and so she waited. Through the slow dimming of her name, through the laughter that returned to court when her sister took the throne, through the cold echo of bells that rang for Elizabeth's coronation before Mary's bones had even cooled. She waited, and perhaps she still does. Not for revenge, not for remembrance, but for someone to tell her story without looking away, to say her name not with fear, but with tenderness, to understand that sometimes the worst monsters in history were only women who were never allowed to heal, never allowed to love, never allowed to rest. So if you find yourself alone one night, staring into glass, and you whisper her name once, or twice, or 3 times, remember this: she won't reach for you, she won't scream, she won't bleed. She'll just look back, and maybe, just maybe, she'll ask, "Did you come for me at last?"